Data visualization is sometimes portrayed as this new fancy field. But what if I told you there are charts older than Jesus? Hi, welcome to Chartbites. My name is Salome, and I believe that learning data visualization also involves absorbing the history and the theory behind it. Promise it isn't as dull as it sounds. So today I'm here to walk you through the ancient roots of data visualization. When it comes to the history of any area of expertise, there is usually little to no agreement on when this area came to be. But this is natural. There is rarely a specific moment or phenomenon that marks the beginning of any discipline. Of course, one can argue that such a moment exists in the history of information visualization. The 1999 book, Readings in Information Visualization, was published to mark the birth of InfoVis and its passage to mainstream use. However, I think we can all agree that visualization existed way before 1999. It is normal to point out William Playfair as the leading pioneer of our beloved field. And this makes sense. Playfair was the first to have a systematic approach to designing abstract representations of statistical data, and he also invented some of our favorite charts and graphs. But I don't believe his choice for doing charts and graphs to present the complex information he had in his hands came out of nowhere. He only chose to design the data in abstract form because he already knew this was a practical means of representing data, even if before him things were a little primitive, or should I say, proto-infographic. The prefix proto means what came before or in the beginning. Playfair himself said that he took inspiration from Joseph Priestley in his linear representation of time or chronologies. But who inspired Priestley, and who inspired the person who inspired Priestley? Although I give due credit to William Playfair, Joseph Priestley, Adolphe Quetelet, Joseph Wainer, Florence Nightingale, John Snow, and all that crowd, I also acknowledge the millions of abstract representations of data before the 18th century, no matter how primitive they look. One benefit of pinning William Playfair as the father of data visualization's modern history is that everything is documented. We are familiar with his process and his choices, we know how and when his works were published, and finally, we are very aware of the influence he has to this day. Before him, this kind of information is difficult to come by, so before him, things are a little blurry. But Howard Gray Funkhauser sheds a light in this blurriness. For him, William Playfair does not mark the absolute beginning of visualization. Instead, his works constitute the final step in the origin of the graphic method. Before Playfair, there were the principles of coordinates and their systematization, the birth of analytic geometry, and the beginnings of statistical compilation. All these happened before the 18th century, so we are following this logic today. Let's travel to 6200 BC to the little town of Konya in Anatolia, or what's today's Turkey. For a time, this was considered the oldest map or bidimensional representation of space. But now, rumor has it, it was forged alongside other murals by the archaeologists who discovered them, so... Nevertheless, there are several representations of territories in ancient Egypt and Babylon from around 600 BC. Most of these are carvings on small clay pieces, and they usually represent both the known world, surrounded by the bitter river, and what lay beyond it. One of these maps mentions a place where the sun cannot be seen, or a place beyond the flight of birds. Eventually, we started to call these circular maps TO maps. The T usually represented a river, like the Nile or the Euphrates or the Mediterranean Sea, while the O meant the ocean that surrounded the Earth. Between these bodies of water, they lay the three continents of the known world: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Even if the circular maps of the known world seem primitive to us, they stayed in fashion for several centuries. We have examples of such maps from as late as the 15th century. But humans were as concerned with mapping the Earth as they were with mapping the night sky, and although these earlier representations in clay can be more poetic than accurate, they hold the foundations of the principles of coordinates map makers and astronomers shared and developed in the following centuries. The first scholars who thought about these questions likely were Hipparchus and Anaximander, whose works were stored in the Library of Alexandria. Yes, the one who burned down. In the 2nd century, Claudius Ptolemy followed their steps and used these principles in his 8-volume textbook, Geography, which boasts more than 8,000 locations, including Iceland and Korea. Although he made a few mistakes, this achievement is quite impressive and holds up to this day. But let us stay in the Middle Ages, or, as they say, the Dark Ages. This period is notable for its lack of cultural and scientific progress, and in fact, there isn't much evidence of developments in any type of visualization. But there is one fascinating phenomenon, an anonymous and lonely chart that outlines the path of the major celestial bodies. This chart is unique because it is entirely different from any other astronomical chart of its time. They tended to be circular, while this is traced on a rectangular grid. Although the author is unknown, there are multiple copies of this chart, whose central principle can be traced back to 900 years before, to Pliny the Elder. One other notable moment of enlightenment in the Dark Ages was the work of Nicolas d'Oresme. He based his theories on the same principles of coordinates we have been talking about, but he applied them not to cartographic or astronomical purposes, but to abstract linear representations of data such as temperatures, time, or distance. So, he was thinking about matrices, curves, and axes 300 years before René Descartes formally introduced these concepts and the idea of analytic geometry to us in the 16th century. As we already know, Descartes' work is one of the bases of designing charts and graphs to this day. The 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries were the time for cartography to shine, even if it was paired with territorial invasion, religious terrorism, and slavery. But that's a whole other discussion and not one about charts. David Woodward predicts that by 1600 there were millions of maps in circulation. Navigators of this time produced astonishing maps, especially the Spanish and the Portuguese, to pull my own rankings. In fact, one of the most significant advances happened on the Portuguese fleet. Martin Beheim, a German tradesman that traveled with the Portuguese, drew the map that would lead to the proposition that the Earth was round, as was discovered by Fernando Magalhães during his fleet's circumnavigation, which ended in 1522. This map was called Aardapfel, or literally Apple Earth, and was designed in 1492. One other advantage of the humanistic way of being from the Renaissance was the search for self-knowledge. We became fascinated with mapping the human body and tracing our own family genealogy. And around this time, we also got very keen on knowing the population and communities to improve their management and find out who owed the king money. In this context, the development of John Gowne's statistical demographics and William Petty's political arithmetic were essential for studying the population and so systematizing the collection and processing of such data. In the 17th century, we were introduced to what I'm calling, for the purpose of this video, proto-visual thinking, through moments when people used charts to try to solve or figure out a problem. These people were Christopher Schneider and Michael Florent van Langren. Schneider essentially invented the small multiples chart to understand the configuration of sunspots, and van Langren used a linear display of latitudes to calculate the distance between Toledo and Rome, which he got wrong, but that's not the point. In the 18th century, and just before Playfair, we have another noteworthy advance by the hand of Edmund Halley. Yes, like the comet. Besides bright things in the sky, Halley was very interested in studying magnetic variation. And so, he got to design a series of maps that combine cartographic accuracy and visual abstraction. And that's it! Very lightly speaking. Then, Joseph Priestley introduced the linear representation of time, and William Playfair published his groundbreaking atlas. You know the rest of the story. I hope. If you don't, let me know and I'll tell it to you. Of course, I didn't cover it all, but I hope I achieved what I came here to do. Convince you that there is a data visualization history before the golden age of charts and graphs. But as usual, I'm not here just to dump information on you and call it a day. I'm also here to make you think. So, I have another provocation for you. William Playfair's peers, especially in statistics and economics, didn't acknowledge his work as groundbreaking as we think it is. And they kind of ostracized him. My question is, what could have happened if they accepted him and the massive advancements of his works? Would this acceptance change the course of visualization's history? Don't forget the references are below. You can treat this comment section as your playground and tell me all your opinions about this. If you have 2 seconds, I would really appreciate if you could answer the questionnaire in the description. I'll be back with more nerdy arguments about data visualization. This is Chartbites. See you next time. There is rarely a moment in time. Oh, I knew. Most of these are carvings on small. Blah. Mediterranean. Ptolemy. In the 17th century, we were introduced to 17th.